I still remember the exact moment I got into music for the first time. I was 6 years old. It was sometime in the early fall of 2008, and I came home from school singing a Black Sabbath song. I didn't know that, of course. When you're 6, you don't really understand where music comes from. Marvel's Iron Man had come out a few months prior, and alongside it came both a resurgence of superhero films and a revitalization of Black Sabbath in the public consciousness thanks to the titular song being used in the credits. That song hit elementary school kids like a bomb. It was inescapable. To me, Iron Man was a song in the same way that Mary Had a Little Lamb and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer were. Melodies so ubiquitous that you're practically born into the world knowing them. When that little version of me came home and sang that chorus around my parents, though, something happened. For the first time that I can remember, my dad decided to show me an album. My dad is not and has never been a huge metal guy, especially if the word prog doesn't come before it. So I don't actually know why he kept this record around, but he pulled out a copy of Paranoid and put it on the turntable as we ate dinner that night. I wish I could tell you that moment blew my mind and changed me forever, but I actually don't remember my reaction to the music all that well. I just remember that after it was over, my mom said something along the lines of, "I think that was a little too intense," and that copy of Paranoid was not spun again. With that in mind, it makes sense that when I eventually did decide to get properly into music and start listening to albums as a hobby as a teenager, metal is where I gravitated first. The big bands from that era for me were a lot of the main thrash ones, Megadeth, Metallica, Slayer, and some of the bands that were huge at the time like Slipknot, but through it all, Black Sabbath remained a staple, and even now, as those other bands have fallen to the wayside for me, I would still very confidently call Sabbath one of my favorite bands, period. That timeless quality as the band that started it all, that changed rock music forever, has survived in spite, and maybe even because of, the fact that the band has been through so many ups and downs in their long, confusing, tangled mess of a run. With the original lineup making one final return to the stage this past July, I felt it would be a good time to commemorate that career and figure out what still works, what doesn't, and which albums might deserve a little bit of critical reevaluation, if any. Before we do that, though, let's talk about who Black Sabbath even is, because it's complicated. So complicated, in fact, that Black Sabbath Members is a whole separate Wikipedia page from the main band one. Starting with the aforementioned original lineup for the first 8 albums, we have Tony Iommi on guitar, Geezer Butler on bass, Bill Ward on drums, and, of course, Ozzy Osbourne on vocals. Of these 4 members, Tony Iommi is the only member who stayed on board for every single album released under the Black Sabbath moniker, with the entire rest of the lineup rotating too fast to keep track of. So many bassists and drummers have come and gone in the nearly 60 years since the original formation, far too many to be worth naming here, but vocalists are a little less ignorable, so let's get into them. First up, and most famously, Ronnie James Dio joined the band in '79 and recorded 2 albums with the band, left, came back in the 90s for 1 album, left again, came back and renamed Black Sabbath to Heaven and Hell for 1 more album, and then died almost immediately. Rest in peace. Ian Gillan from Deep Purple followed him up for 1 album in '83, then got switched out for another Deep Purple vocalist, Glenn Hughes, for an album in '86, and then left the rest up to Tony Martin, who would sing on every album not already covered by the other singers I just mentioned. Before we get into the video, I want to address the elephant in the room. This is a video I've been working on since the beginning of 2025, with the initial goal of having it released alongside Black Sabbath's final performance on July 5th. When the scale of this video ballooned the way it did, it became obvious I wouldn't be hitting that deadline, so I put it on the back burner in favor of other smaller projects, as well as some non-YouTube commissioned work. Just over 2 weeks later, Ozzy Osbourne passed away at 76 years old. It was a heartbreaking loss. He's one of those people who I just kind of forgot could die, assuming he would just be around forever if he'd survived what he had. After this, I had a really hard time bringing myself to finish this video. It was too raw for me, and especially because a lot of the writing I had left to do was pretty negative, I felt gross doing it so close to his passing. Ozzy was a fucking legend, and the last thing I wanted to do was look and feel like I was capitalizing on his passing. I'm not going to go back and revise my writing and put "was" in every sentence about him like a Wikipedia article. Instead, I've decided to leave all my writing in its original form as a kind of time capsule of how I felt before and after his passing. With such a confusing spiderweb of a lineup, it's no wonder that Black Sabbath were as inconsistent as they were, with some amazing albums showing up even into the 2000s, but also some of the absolute worst albums I have ever heard in my life. I very rarely speak negatively about any music on this channel because my goal is always to introduce people to music that they will like, but in this case, the task of telling people what not to bother with is just as important as highlighting the best of the best. You'll hear me passionately lift up and tear down albums in equal measure here, but know that I do all of it with love, because even at their lowest, Black Sabbath has always been one of my favorite bands. Let's start. 1970 was the year it all happened. In February, Sabbath released their self-titled debut, which featured what is pretty much inarguably the first metal song, and just 7 months later, they released the genre's first masterpiece. In every respect, Paranoid is the blueprint that every single metal band and artist owes their existence to. If they don't cite it as an influence, then their influences do. Where the first record was still heavily indebted to blues, psychedelic, and hard rock, making huge steps towards metal but still keeping one foot on the shore, Paranoid dove headfirst into what made that record so impactful, and the result is one of those classic albums that can still hold its own well, even now on the back of its varied, genius songwriting and top-of-the-line performances on all front. Paranoid is not only the obvious best place to start listening to Black Sabbath, it's one of the first albums anyone should ever listen to, period. To really understand how revolutionary this album was, we have to talk about the history of guitar distortion a little bit. See, guitarists had been using distorted equipment from as early as the 1930s, but for the longest time, the only way distortion was actually produced was through equipment that was either faulty or damaged on accident or intentionally. It wasn't until the early 60s that we started getting early iterations of fuzz boxes, prototypical distortion pedals, and only in 1965 did a guitarist score a major hit using one, that of course being Keith Richards with the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction. As soon as that happened, it was off to the races, and the way the guitar was played changed forever. Almost overnight, we had sensations like Jimi Hendrix and Carlos Santana making distortion pedals a staple of their sound, and in the years immediately following, we had musicians like Ritchie Blackmore and Jimmy Page defining the sound of hard rock that would dominate the 70s. Tony Iommi was a little different, though. The other guys could rip nasty solos and had licks for days, but Iommi had riffs, and not just one or two either. The guitar riff wasn't his invention. Blues artists used them all the time, think Muddy Waters' Mannish Boy, for example, but there was something about the sheer quantity that would flow out of Iommi's hands and the way he would sequence them that was just so unlike anything that had been done before. It was pretty much all two-finger power chords, a technique basically forced upon him by the fact that he lost half his fingertips in a factory accident, drowned in as much distortion as those rudimentary fuzz pedals could muster, and arranged in a fashion far more dissonant than anything rock music had done prior. Sabbath's titular song on the debut invented heavy, but Paranoid solidified its definition and showed that music didn't have to be slow to be heavy, the basis on which the entire metal genre would be built upon. It's really easy to get caught up on the guitar with this record, and for good reason, because it's the most obviously revolutionary aspect of the album, but it is far from the only way that Paranoid pushed boundaries and shaped what came after. Loud, deep, dissonant guitars can be heavy in an abstract, cathartic, brain-feel way, but you know what really gets you headbanging? The rhythm behind those meaty riffs. And that's where the other two instrumentalists on this thing show up. Geezer Butler is, for my money, the secret sauce that keeps this whole thing operating on the crazy level that it does. His playing is so distinct from what we now expect from a metal basis, rooted far more in blues and jazz, and acting as a melodic counterpoint to Iommi's rudimentary, visceral power chords. The heavy moments are only as heavy as they are because of the bass lines. The atmospheric passages rely on them to propel the music forward, and you'd best believe the grooves are groovin'. Bill Ward on drums here may not be the most technically incredible drummer in the world. He probably ranks around the same as Deep Purple's Ian Pace, and John Bonham wipes the floor with both of them. But in the context of Black Sabbath, there's nobody I would rather hear. He strikes this perfect balance of lockstep rhythm with a still dynamic range of emotion behind every hit, and the cymbal work on this record is particularly expressive. And then, of course, there's Ozzy Osbourne. Even from this era, you'd have a pretty hard time arguing that Ozzy is the greatest singer in the world, and past this point, he gets cleared by most of the big metal band singers, but you would also have an equally hard time arguing he's not the best frontman the band could have had at this time. Black Sabbath is one of the most famous bands of all time, probably on the same level as Nirvana or U2, and yet I'd wager that most people don't even know that Ozzy isn't the only singer the band ever had. He's not even on half of their albums. That's just how iconic his doomed, echoing wail is to the band's sound. Here on Paranoid, he's still delivering one of his more grounded, rock-based performances compared to what would come later, and it lends the album a sense of dread that might catch you off guard from an album so old and so popular. It's not a scary or overly intense album by any means, but that darkness still resonates clearly. But what is an album if not a collection of songs? We have all the musicians required for a great band, but great bands can make truly terrible albums, as we'll see later. Thankfully, Paranoid is also the songwriting peak for the band, as it is full to bursting with unbelievable generational tracks. From the very first second, Warpigs blows the door down with what must be the loudest guitar ever recorded up to that point, an epic intro that still remains unparalleled to this day, and then the song itself, which is a pointed teardown of the Vietnam War, as most good rock music of the time was. The 8-minute runtime is never once felt, marching ever forward with two of the best instrumental breaks of the band's career, placed snugly in the midst of sparse and impossible-to-ignore verses. This leads perfectly into the breakneck speed of the title track, which is musically simple to a degree that feels almost comedic now, but so utterly perfect that it became the band's huge anthem. Speaking of huge anthems, after a welcome bit of languid reprieve, we reach Iron Man, a song so iconic that I almost can't listen to it. I definitely don't choose to listen to it individually, having heard it so many times in so many different contexts, but within the album, it's a clear highlight and another piece of flawless songwriting. From here, we get even heavier, with tracks like Electric Funeral and Hand of Doom going beyond the fact that Sabbath invented metal, and immediately inventing the first subgenre of metal, doom metal. These two songs are slow, monotonous, and so heavy, really soaking in that dread and, dare I say, doom that made the band so powerful. Both tracks do pick up the pace significantly at points, but that didn't stop their heaviest moments from paving the way for bands like Pagan Altar and Saint Vitus to run with almost a decade later. The record closes on a high note as well with Fairies Wear Boots, a full-on rocker of an ending that blasts ahead for a solid 6 minutes before fading out into silence, ending the album and with it changing the future of music as a whole. There are very few records as important as Paranoid by Black Sabbath. Fewer than that, though, are records that important which remain impressive to this day. This is a comfort album for me, yes, one I can always come back to and feel like a little bit of home, but it's also one that holds up to scrutiny no matter how much I overplay it. If I ever have children, this will be one of the first albums I make them listen to, because it perfectly shows what rock music can be, what the album format can be, and what the birth of a new genre looks like. You've already heard this album, no doubt, but pause the video and go do it again. Where does a band go after literally inventing heavy? Well, less than a year later, we learn the answer. It was get so much heavier. Remember that injury we talked about earlier where Iommi lost the tips of his fingers? Well, Naturally, that made it pretty difficult and painful to play, and while he did come up with workarounds like makeshift thimbles he would tape to his fingers, it was still basically impossible for him to properly bend his guitar strings, and since he couldn't feel them, he would often end up pressing way too hard to compensate. The band made it work for the first 2 records, but if they were to continue in the direction they were going, they would have to make some adjustments, the first of which came on Master of Reality when, for the sake of Iommi's comfort, the band tuned their instruments down a whole 3 half steps to C-sharp standard. A pretty common misconception is that the lower the tuning, the heavier the music. This is pretty easily debunked just by listening to most traditional doom metal, and even a lot of mathcore and metalcore in modern day. Vector even proved in the 2010s that you can still make heavy music by tuning your instruments up. A heavy riff will sound heavy in any tuning, but it is true that lower tunings give you a higher ceiling for just how heavy you can get if you play them right. For Iommi, switching tunings was a decision made out of necessity. He couldn't feel the strings through his makeshift fingertips, so he would press too hard, and bending in standard tuning was nearly impossible. By loosening the strings, he allowed himself a lot more leeway in the ways he was able to perform, and inadvertently changed the trajectory of the genre he invented just a year prior. These days, you're not likely to hear a death, doom, or sludge metal band playing in anything tuned less than a half step down, and extended range guitars are a whole industry in and of themselves just to facilitate lower and lower tunings for metal. To this day, though, what Iommi did on Master of Reality remains a prime example of what the perfect heavy riff sounds like. Meaty, plodding, drenched in overdrive, and repeated just enough times to lock you into its groove without losing its luster. The sloppier sounds of these looser strings blend nicely with the distortion to create a sound even more dynamic and unpredictable than the one found on Paranoid, and deeper, bassier tone would decades later become the blueprint for stoner metal bands like Sleep and Electric Wizard to work off of. And speaking of stoners, let's talk about some of the tracks on this thing, because while they might not be quite as universal and iconic as Paranoid's highlights, I think they're arguably more interesting in a lot of ways, starting with the opening track, Sweet Leaf. In contrast to the dread and nihilism on prior albums, this celebration of the therapeutic effects of marijuana would feel downright inspirational if not for the down-tuned riffs underpinning. Ozzy has started to inch towards his more affected vocal style that we'll get more of in the future, but here he still feels grounded in the same way he did previously, and while his performance is pretty similar to that on Paranoid, there's a bit of a different approach to his delivery that feels a little less doomed and a little more dominant and in control. That's most obvious on the perhaps controversial second track, After Forever, written by Geezer Butler, where Ozzy very confidently and assertively proclaims in no uncertain terms that Christ is the only way to achieve heaven in the end. A bit of a strange detour, to be sure, and not one that the band ever really returned to after that point, but I think it's important to note that in making this song, they managed to get ahead of the satanic panic that would taint all metal discourse for nearly the entire remainder of the century. Despite the fact that the band made their faith very visible in their art, they still couldn't escape the panic, and became one of the appointed scapegoats of the movement. Maybe they're not entirely to blame, though, because in the televangelist's defense, songs like Children of the Grave, Lord of This World, and Into the Void sound truly evil. The former especially opens with this infectious, irresistible march driven forward by Butler's bass playing and a vital drum performance from Ward. I might not have given him the most praise of anyone on the previous album, but that's only because of where he would end up going on Master of Reality. He was still no John Bonham, and realistically never would be, but in the months between albums, he developed a playing style all his own, one which seemingly refuses to stay in one place for too long. It's a more explorative, enthralling performance he delivers on this record, and it's a huge part of why it's such a masterpiece. The album ends with potentially its greatest song, and its most definitive musical statement. Into the Void is Master of Reality to me. Slow, dissonant but melodic riffs, patient drum rhythms, and a sense of space and atmosphere that remains totally unique to this record. It breaks out into speedier sections, slows down for some absolutely nasty passages in the back half, but all throughout, it never stops delivering that heavy, unique brand of psychedelia that this era of the band did best. Black Sabbath never released another album as revolutionary as Paranoid, how could they? But Master of Reality was as close as they ever got, propelling their newly created genre forward by a whole decade in the span of just 35 minutes. Next, let's take it back to the beginning with the self-titled album that started it all, and, more specifically, the title track that invented a genre. Black Sabbath, by Black Sabbath, on the album Black Sabbath, is unquestionably one of the greatest songs ever recorded. That looming devil's tritone, the funeral dirge drumming, and Ozzy's haunting wails. It feels like more than a song, rather just a piece of recording that has always existed in some form. Before this, there was, by no possible metric, another song that sounded like it, and even after it, there was very little that could even attempt to recreate its magic. The track's 6 minutes are paced masterfully, and when the tempo does eventually pick up, it doesn't shed its cloud of doom, instead building urgency and tension until its eventual demise. As a statement, an introduction, and a first attempt for a fresh-faced new band, I can't think of a better piece than this one. It still might be their best cut, and in a world where most genres have heavily contested origins, I can't think of one more cut and dry than this one. There almost doesn't need to be a rest of the album. The song alone had such immense impact that it could have been released as a single and been just as amazing. With half a dozen tracks following it up, though, Black Sabbath's debut sits in a position of still being a transitional moment out of rock and into metal, a band figuring out what parts of their sound were unique and worth following up on in the future. Elements of the heavy metal sound they would perfect show up frequently across the record, especially on tracks like The Wizard and NIB, where those unmistakable shifting power chords are inescapable, but just as frequently, the record is content to live comfortably in hard rock territory, leaning way harder into blues licks than they ever would again. Is that to this record's detriment? Not really. Newer fans looking to hear more like the title track might be disappointed, but as a hard rock album, it does a fantastic job and still stands as one of the best of the genre, even ignoring the nascent metal elements. This isn't bog standard or generic hard rock either. It's not Paint by Numbers, Deep Purple, or Led Zeppelin worship like a lot of what would come immediately after. This record has a lot to say and innovations to make in the genre, even though its aspirations would place it as something a little more. The 10-minute closer Warning is a great example of this, feeling a bit like a rewrite of a lot of the blues rock coming out throughout the 60s, but with that haunted Ozzy Osbourne flair in the vocals to keep it distinctly Sabbath. Iommi's guitar playing here and all throughout the record is some of the most outwardly virtuosic we'd ever hear it, playing crazy blues licks and chord progressions all over the place in a way we wouldn't really hear from him again. It's especially wild considering how uncomfortable he's said this playing style is for him, and yet he still manages to pull it off so well and even outclass some other guitarists in that field. Not every track is a hit. Evil Woman in particular comes off as fairly generic and repetitive by the end, and the song they replaced it with on the current reissue of Streaming isn't better by much. Sleeping Village, towards the end of the record, briefly hints at the psychedelic detours that would become a staple of their track lists going forward, before switching up into a weird combo of some of the most played-out blues ideas and some actually really impressive allusions to metal. It's a weird track list, one not nearly as consistently mind-blowing as on the two records that came after, but for this era, you're lucky if a classic rock album only has one or two hit or miss tracks, and basically no albums from this time period had highs as high as this. Black Sabbath, by Black Sabbath, which contains the classic song Black Sabbath, would be one of the most essential rock albums of the 70s, even if this whole metal thing never went anywhere. It's a prime example of what the genre can do best, while simultaneously pushing it forward and growing past it in ways that it's kind of hard to even fully realize the ramifications of. Its limitations make it hard to pitch as the absolute first place you should look, but within this discography, there's very few albums more important than this one. Now let's jump ahead a full decade and talk about the second most important era of Sabbath, the period immediately after Ozzy Osbourne got kicked out of the band. Drug and alcohol abuse had always been an issue for Ozzy. Growing up poor in Birmingham and then suddenly achieving worldwide fame will do that to you, but by 1979, the problem had gotten to such unreasonable levels that something had to be done. It got to the point where it was starting to impact the quality of the music, or even Ozzy's ability to show up to rehearsals at all, so after a full decade with one singular lineup, it was decided that he had to go. History has shown that, for Ozzy, this is the best thing that could have happened. He linked up with a few new, equally phenomenal musicians like Randy Rhoads, and kicked off a solo career that wound up being just as, if not more successful than his run in Black Sabbath. The same cannot be said for his former band, however. Sabbath, post-Osbourne, is a long, turbulent journey with highs and lows in almost equal measure, but as time went on, the album sales and band's relevance would continue to dwindle. For a brief moment, though, it looked like things were going to be okay, and that's because the first singer to fill Ozzy's gargantuan shoes was the late, great Ronnie James Dio. The difference between the two singers is practically night and day. Ozzy's voice was always iconic and worked perfectly for the band's initial run of albums, but as a technical singer, he wasn't that much better than most of the guys you'll hear in cover bands at dive bars nowadays. His appeal was as essentially a horror movie protagonist, an everyman who just happened to have seen some cosmically terrifying shit and needed to write songs about it. Dio, on the other hand, is a real-ass singer. Not only is he a wildly professional singer with a ton of credits under his belt as the frontman of Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, but on a technical level, there are still very few to this day that can match what he was able to do in his prime, and this was his prime. For as short-lived as his initial run with the band was, lasting only 2 albums, it was a very welcome breath of fresh air for the band, which ushered them into the 80s with class and dignity. Musically, things were obviously going to have to change to suit the new vocal style, and boy did they. From the very first second of the album, we're met with a far more epic, fast-paced metal style akin to what Priest, Maiden, and the other new wave of British heavy metal acts were doing at the time and would continue to do into the next decade. Everything is done at seemingly double speed, and Iommi's guitar playing especially has gotten flashier in the decades since that first tritone riff. There's some soloing on this album that stands toe-to-toe with some of the best of its era, and while a part of me certainly misses the doomy riffing of those early records, for what it's trying to be, it's doing just about the best it can. As always, Butler's bass playing deserves to be commended as well. Particularly, I think the more melodically driven focus of this music almost serves his playing style better, giving him a higher overhead for how intricate his lines can be. The biggest difference to be found on this album, however, isn't so much musical as it is tonal, because if Ozzy was a horror protagonist, then Dio is a full-blown fantasy hero. Nearly every ounce of dread and terror has been stripped from this sound, and instead we get something that, while not quite optimistic, is certainly less drenched in nihilism. The second track, Children of the Sea, opens with the line, "In the misty morning on the edge of time," which is just about the most traditional fantasy writing I've ever heard, and Neon Nights goes full Tolkien, talking about circles and rings, dragons and kings. To be clear, this is no nerdier than what Butler was writing for Ozzy to sing, and I think that change of pace is a welcome one, but know what you're getting into if that kind of thing is kryptonite for you. On the whole, though, Heaven and Hell is well deserving of its classic status. It's a different interpretation of Sabbath's mission statement, but still feels just right enough not to feel like they should have just made a new band. Tracks like Die Young and the title track show the band in peak form, and while we've not yet talked about the couple of albums that led to this one, trust me when I say that this is a massively revitalized version of the band from what Ozzy and co were putting out towards the end of the 70s. There are better albums than this that we haven't talked about yet, but as a look into what Sabbath can look like without Osbourne, this is more important than any of those. But back to Ozzy's era, let's talk about the album the band used to follow up their trilogy, Black Sabbath Volume 4. While the first 3 albums, all of which we've talked about at this point, sounded very different from each other, the albums themselves all had very distinct sonic identities of their own. The debut was bluesy, Paranoid was riff central, and Master of Reality was earth-shatteringly heavy. Maybe there would be a psychedelic track or something in the middle to spice things up, but in general the band would pick a sound and go all in on it. With Volume 4, all of that goes out the window, and we see Sabbath in their most unrestrained, creative, and sometimes confusing form. For better or worse, no 2 songs sound alike on this record, and they seem to be pushing and prodding at the boundaries of metal and seeing what will and won't work, and occasionally just abandoning the genre altogether. In less than a single second, The album reveals itself to be something different for the band, as the 8-minute opener Wheels of Confusion lets out a bluesy birthing wail before settling into a heavy but distinctly bright-sounding main riff. One thing to note immediately is that while this album's heaviest moments can certainly rival those on Master of Reality, the tone of the album is almost its opposite. Volume 4 is not a dark, brooding album, but rather one fueled by adrenaline and probably a ton of uppers. In a way, it's probably just as influential on the shape of metal to come as the previous records. If those laid the groundwork for doom and stoner metal to come decades later, this album showed that not all metal had to be gloomy and depressing, giving way to the new wave of British heavy metal that would immediately follow it, and stuff like hair and power metal down the road. The remainder of the opening track perfectly displays what this album is at its best, a sound that is distinctly Sabbath, but is drawing back from the well of rock music to find other gemstones to fashion into its crown. In the case of Wheels of Confusion, that gem is prog rock, and it builds this huge, multifaceted structure which contains some of the most invigorating momentum and flashy performances of the band's entire career. From this point onwards, all bets are off for what the record can sound like. There's plenty for more traditionalist fans of the band. Songs like Tomorrow's Dream and St. Vitus Dance play it relatively safe with the formula, and there's a ton of really heavy material on here as well, which we'll get to shortly, but the most important song is honestly not even one of the metal ones. Instead, it's the ballad, which shows up as track 3 on this thing, Changes. The unfortunate truth is that a good portion of folks watching this video will only know this song as the Big Mouth theme song, but in all honesty, its reputation has never been that much higher than that. Some people love this song, and I'll tentatively put myself in that camp, but for many fans, it represented a shift in ethos for the band with a ripple effect that would irrevocably change the trajectory of a certain brand of hard rock and heavy metal. The song itself is fine, an otherwise pretty unmemorable sappy piano track, but the fact that it happens to be placed in the midst of some of the heaviest music ever recorded at the time set a precedent for so many crappy 80s bands who haphazardly threw in the most saccharine and disingenuous ballads on their albums. I really like Changes, but if I could sacrifice it to make sure bands like Poison couldn't coast on tracks like Every Rose Has Its Thorn for literal decades, I would do it in a heartbeat. Past that point on the record, though, Volume 4 contains some of the best heavy material that Black Sabbath ever did. Supernaut and Snowblind are the most prominent of these, with the former being this blitzkrieg of adrenaline complete with a rocking drum solo and acoustic break, and the latter feeling simultaneously like metal's answer to the Beatles' I Want You, and also a distinctly forward-thinking track which nicely blends in a string section behind Iommi's solo in the back half. The following cornucopia has a main riff that's so sloppy and heavy that it borders on sounding ridiculous, but works out because of how Ozzy sells his vocal performance on it, and the album ends with one of my picks for most underrated Sabbath song of this era, the multi-phased epic Under the Sun. Every riff on this thing is Doom City, and even on the relatively upbeat middle section, it still retains an absurd amount of weight, and it closes the album in perhaps the most epic fashion the band ever saw. On the whole, Volume 4 is a confusing, kind of messy album which juggles way more ideas than any album they did before or since, and while not all of them reach the highs that were expected following their two big masterpieces, they give it a hell of a lot more personality than most of what would come after. The best songs on this album are their best songs, period, and across the board, the instrumental performances are improved by leaps and bounds, with the clear highlights being the way Bill Ward has been allowed so much more room for his drumming arrangements to breathe, and Iommi's soloing being massively highlighted across the entire record. If you ever wanted to know what a weird Sabbath album that's still fantastic sounds like, this is it. By all metrics, Volume 4 was a smashing success, one that led the band onto a massive, sprawling tour, a tour that would mark the beginning of the end for this iteration of Black Sabbath. I mentioned briefly the drug abuse and alcohol issues that led to Osbourne's unceremonious departure at the end of the 70s, but it wasn't just Ozzy. Everyone was strung out on whatever they could get their hands on, and when you're a band as big as Sabbath was in their prime, you can get your hands on a hell of a lot. It got so bad that the band were forced, after an incident where Iommi walked off stage and collapsed, to cancel the remaining dates of their tour and take their first ever break since starting the band. Quickly, Sabbath started working on music for their next album. Kind of. For as disastrous as the Volume 4 tour was for the band, the music they were touring was great and the reception was fantastic. So, to recapture some of that magic, they went back to the same recording studio they made their last album in, only to find that they had no ideas. More specifically, Tony had no ideas, and this is where it becomes apparent that Tony Iommi is the beating heart of Black Sabbath, and that without him, there's nothing, because as he tells it,
everybody was sitting there, waiting for me to come up with something. I just couldn't think of anything. And if I didn't come up with anything, nobody would do anything. I panicked because I didn't have a single idea about what to write. It might have been the drugs, it could have been the pressure, but either way, I felt it was my fault.
So, after about a month with no results, the band decided to try something new, renting out the Clearwater Castle in Gloucestershire to see if the change of scenery would perhaps revitalize that missing spark, and in a short amount of time, that proved to be exactly the case. Whether it was the drugs, the paranoid tensions in the band, some kind of haunting, or a synergy of all three, something about the castle brought out Iommi's best side. One night, he finally figured out a monstrous riff, one of the best he would ever write, and when he showed it to the band, it was off to the races. That riff would be the main riff to the title track for their next album, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. What's immediately obvious in listening to their fifth album is the scope of ambition on display here. Volume 4 was an album with a ton of variety and a very broad sonic palette, but individually, its songs were quite focused. On their next record, the band took clear influences from the prog rock boom that was happening in the UK at the time, leading to a far greater range of sounds within each and every song, even if the resulting album isn't quite as varied as the previous on the whole. The greatest examples of this leaning are on the first and final tracks on the record, starting with the aforementioned title track. Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is a track so perfect it almost defies description. It immediately shows the scale this album is working at, with a fantastically heavy opening riff and verse section, which cleanly switches up into a beautiful acoustic chorus filled with clean blues licks and one of Ozzy's best vocal performances. What's most memorable about this track, however, is the bridge. After laying down an exhilarating solo, Iommi breaks out what, to this point in metal history, was the heaviest riff ever put to tape. Even today, it's hard to listen to it without getting completely sucked into just how nasty it is. Even 5 albums deep, and even as the band were starting to move towards other sounds, they remained on the cutting edge of the heavy sound they defined to begin with. Keys and synths make a more prominent appearance on this record as well, which isn't quite a first for the band, but the amount they show up on this album is pretty unprecedented. Sabracadabra is the clearest example of this, with a super spacey classic synth solo towards the middle, and an epic 2-minute rocking piano jam closing it out. Who Are You takes it a step further, entirely replacing Iommi's guitar with an array of what now sounds like retro-futuristic nostalgia bait, but in 1973 was the newest wave of synth music available. That's not the only unique instrument choice on the album either, with Looking for Today prominently making use of flutes, and Spiral Architect featuring a full string arrangement conducted by Will Malone, who would go on to do the strings on tons of records in the 90s, most notably Massive Attack's Unfinished Sympathy and The Verve's Bittersweet Symphony. Spiral Architect has always been a favorite Sabbath song for me, due in no small part to that epic string section, but also just the way it evolves melodically over its runtime, and the way it uses contemporary hard rock cliches to push it above and beyond until its grand finale climax. The album isn't completely without flaw. There's a few dud moments in the back half, and in general the mastering on the album isn't very consistent at all, even with the remastered versions available on streaming, but the songs on here that do shine are undoubtedly among their best. Whether it be the heavier stuff like Killing Yourself to Live and A National Acrobat, or the wild, exciting experiments happening elsewhere, it's at a level that few bands in rock were reaching at the time. This is considered by many to be the climax of Ozzy's era of the band, and I would be inclined to agree if not for one more record. Okay, so I hope this video has been entertaining or informative so far. I feel pretty good about my writings on the top albums, but I will admit that there haven't really been any hot takes or surprises yet. Well, how's this for one? Sabotage, Black Sabbath's 6th album, released in 1975, is my favorite Sabbath album, period. Don't let Bill Ward's red tights on this hilariously bad album cover fool you. This may not be part of what most Sabbath fans consider their prime run, but Sabotage is far from a dud in their discography, and while there are some very valid reasons not to consider it your favorite, the fact it doesn't even seem to make an appearance in most people's top 5s is kind of crazy to me, because this is no less a quality record than Volume 4 or Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, and to me it can go toe-to-toe with the big dogs we talked about at the start of this video like 40 minutes ago or something. There's a little bit of something for every kind of Black Sabbath fan here, all refined to their finest potential, and no shortage of new and interesting ideas to keep it fresh. If for any reason you've skipped Sabotage up to this point, consider this your sign to change that. First of all, the album starts with what I would consider to be the best A-side to a record in their whole career. There's steep competition, even in the realm of 3 big songs and a little instrumental A-sides, which they love to do, but with Hole in the Sky, Symptom of the Universe, and Megalomania all back-to-back with an excellent little 50-second acoustic interlude for pacing, I have a hard time imagining a way it could get any better. First comes Hole in the Sky, the perfect Sabbath opener, and one of the most invigorated songs the band ever recorded. That absurdly simple but face-meltingly effective guitar riff, Butler's gut-churning bass tone, a huge drum presence from Ward, and one of Ozzy's angriest-sounding vocal performances, it's all just so viscerally appealing on every level, pushing above and beyond much of the band's best works to that point. Then, after an abrupt cutoff and a beautiful short interlude, comes my personal pick for best Black Sabbath track ever, Symptom of the Universe. You like the band in stupidly heavy mode? The main verse riff has you covered. Do you like when Iommi does a more technical lick in between sections? This one might be his best ever. Crazy melodic solos, doomed passionate Ozzy performances, how about a gorgeous Latin-inspired folk outro? This song has got it all, and especially with the recent 2021 remaster of the album, it all sounds absolutely massive in all the best ways. Every bit of this song is Sabbath at peak performance, and the next song doesn't step back in any regard. If Symptom is the best Sabbath song, Megalomania is their most ambitious, at almost 10 minutes long and covering pretty much every base that Symptom and Hole in the Sky didn't. We start with a doomy, dripping atmospheric intro which uses a sweet vocal melody and a piano riff to transition cleanly into a hard rock rager, which gets more and more metal as time goes on, with multiple ripping solos and a refrain towards the end of the track which remains one of their catchiest to date. For many of even the biggest fans of this album, its B-side struggles not to pale in comparison to the A, and while I won't necessarily argue it to be better than 3 of the greatest rock and metal songs ever made, I think it deserves to have the same respect put on its name. Up first comes Thrill of It All, a hard rocker that starts off pretty sparse before building up in the back half into one of the most lush instrumental palettes the band had done up to that point in their career. It's a fantastic song, one that might not be particularly metal, all things considered, but shows the band flexing a set of muscles we don't get to see as often. The next 2 songs are clearly why this side has less of a reputation, but I'm here to defend them. Super Czar is a weird guitar instrumental which sees Tony Iommi riffing for almost 4 minutes, alternating between 4/4 and 5/4, with a huge chorus singing behind him the whole time. It's a strange, alien sound for the band, and I fully understand not being able to get into it, but to me, there's something so enticing about it, and I think compared to some of the weirdo instrumentals on other Sabbath records, this one works the best for me. Next is Am I Going Insane, which is very clearly the poppiest song the band had done up to this point besides Changes. That's not to say it doesn't rock, and there's no shortage of staple Sabbath-isms throughout it, like the ominous chord changes in the verses and Butler's plodding bass line sat prominently underneath, but it is far from a metal song. And you know what? It's awesome! This track is the clearest indication of the direction that Ozzy Osbourne would take on his solo material, blending poppier songwriting into some of the heavier sounds that Sabbath pioneered for a maximum commercial success and viability without sacrificing some of the truly great things about metal music. The Writ closes us out with another long one. At almost 9 minutes, we see the band continuing with some of the proggier inclinations they learned on the last record, and the result is a closer to rival Spiral Architect without ever feeling like a retread of ideas. Had the band called it quits here, it would have been the perfect end to a perfect discography, even though I would miss a handful of albums that come later, which we'll talk about in a moment. Sabotage may not have a fascinating story behind it like Bloody Sabbath, and it may not have been revolutionary like their first three, but what it has is a whole lot of heart and a near-perfect execution of its ideas, whether those ideas appeal to you or not. It's my favorite Sabbath record, and I think it always will be. Jumping forward a handful of albums, we've got another Dio classic in his second album with Sabbath, Mob Rules. Released in 1981, just a year after Heaven and Hell, the only thing this new iteration of the band had to prove was that they could keep consistent after the high point they started off on. Things got off to a rocky start, with Bill Ward taking a break to get his health in check, but Iommi brought in Axis drummer Vinny Appice into the fold, and things were pretty quickly on track for another great album. And that's what this album is. It's another really impressive outing by Dio and the Sabbath guys. Appice's drumming is more than serviceable, opting to take a more traditional approach to his core drum rhythms rather than trying to replicate Ward's swing, and instead makes up for it with his own set of technical chops that get plenty of opportunities to shine all over the record. This more traditionally hard rock approach to the rhythm section gives the band a new bit of songwriting challenge that they pass with flying colors, and the result is an album that might be significantly more standard aesthetically than any of their previous high points, but the quality is undeniable. Iommi seems to have a near infinite number of riffs left in him, even 10 albums deep, and while I think Geezer Butler doesn't quite get the chance to shine as often as usual, his standout moments are still excellent, especially on the title track where his propulsive growl brings the whole thing together. Dio was already a known quantity by this point, of course, so he couldn't fall back on the novelty of him being the first new Sabbath vocalist, but he didn't have to, because he brings his A-game all over this album, in particular on doomier tracks like The Sign of the Southern Cross and Falling Off the Edge of the World. There, he doesn't quite recapture the doomed feelings Ozzy was known for, instead taking the reins as the invoker of said doom, and decreeing that who or whatever his subjects may be will meet his wrath. Ultimately, I think that's the key distinction between Ozzy Sabbath and Dio Sabbath. One feels darker and more horror-coded on account of the vocals really selling that desperation, and the other feels more epic and bold, almost mischievous at times, because despite the fact that Dio was a super short guy, he has the voice to convince you that he can do just about anything with ease, whether it be over a slow dirge or a blitzkrieg rager. The band plays to both of these vocalist sounds exceptionally well, and I think that while some people were obviously alienated by the change of tone between eras, anyone who could just appreciate good rock music in all its forms was happy with both. Ultimately, there's not a lot more to it than that besides pointing out some of the banger tracks that show up on Mob Rules. The title track is classic heavy metal in all its glory, with a wildly impressive guitar solo that feels like it could go on forever. Sign of the Southern Cross is about as dark as Dio's time with the band ever got, with an almost proggy song structure holding its 8-minute runtime together. Edge of the World is dripping with atmosphere, and Turn Up the Night feels almost like proto-power metal, with the fact it's in a major key surprisingly not detracting at all with how awesome it sounds. Mob Rules is another super solid outing for the band, proving that Ozzy wasn't the only thing that made Sabbath Sabbath. And while I'm sure the consensus is that Heaven and Hell is the better album, I honestly think it's a pretty close toss-up. After this one, Dio would leave the band after a mess of creative differences surrounding the production of their Live Evil concert album, taking Vinny Appice with him and going off to start his own wildly successful solo career. This left the band without a steady frontman for the rest of their existence, and while Dio, and Ozzy for that matter, would return for individual albums in the future, the era of consistent Sabbath was over, and so began the band's dark era. Before we talk about that though, let's jump ahead a decade and talk about another good album, one which happens to also feature Ronnie James Dio on vocals, Dehumanizer. Vinny and Dio made up with Butler and Iommi, and after an assortment of varying degrees of failures, it seems they were exactly the shot in the arm the band needed to keep afloat and get things back in gear. Dehumanizer isn't necessarily one of Sabbath's best ever albums, at least not in comparison to the ones we've talked about so far, but as you'll see, Just Good is a pretty substantial step up from some of the places the band had been in the years between. And honestly, I think Dehumanizer is a step above Just Good. It's a super solid album that, while it doesn't come near the heights of the past, is well worth listening to, especially if you're a fan of Dio's time with the band. Now 15 to 20 years removed from their accepted prime, I'm always impressed with how well every member of Sabbath at this point managed to put their heads together and reel in some of the slack that had been floating around the past few records. Iommi in particular feels invigorated, maybe even more so than he did during parts of their prime. This is an album from 1992, mind you. Black and death metal were kicking all the way into gear and getting ready to reach their first artistic peaks in the mid-90s, and thrash metal's prime had already come and gone for the most part. Why should anyone have expected that this relic of a bygone age would have anything exciting to say? Well, they did, and a lot of that seems to stem from a strong understanding of what made, at the time, modern metal work, without going all in and trend chasing. What we got is a traditional heavy metal album from the 90s that doesn't feel out of time, doesn't feel like an homage to any kind of golden era, but manages to feel right at home in the same industry that was producing acts like Alice in Chains, Bolt Thrower, and Demolition Hammer. A big part of this strength is owed to the production of this record. In general, a classic metal band modernizing their production is a recipe for disaster, but what Queen and ELO producer Mac was able to do on this album feels tasteful in a way that almost none of Sabbath's contemporaries, or even Sabbath's next couple of albums, ever did. There's certainly a level of polish to it that exceeds their Golden Age albums, but we don't really lose much of that grit and heft that makes this sound special. In particular, Iommi's guitar tone on this thing is absolutely golden. It's nowhere near as dirty as what the broader metal scene was working with at the time, especially in the underground, but it's got that sweet digging bite to it that's so important to Dio Sabbath's sound, and the guitar solo tones are no slouch either, properly selling every performance all over the album. The grittier, heavier production is matched perfectly by Dio's performance. Now a decade older than he was on Mob Rules, his voice has changed a fair bit, and for the better. He sounds so much angrier on Dehumanizer, much more driven and energized than on his other Sabbath records, and it honestly kind of reminds me of how forceful Rob Halford's voice sounds on some of those early Judas Priest albums. When we get really classic Sabbath songwriting, like on Too Late, Ronnie sounds straight up ferocious as he belts and cries through the refrain over one of Iommi's best riffs. The songwriting all over this thing is also just solid as hell. None of the songs here match up to their best ever, or even quite the peaks that those early 80s albums hit, but the fact that it manages to get close at all is super impressive, and in an ocean of less than stellar late 80s and early 90s releases, it's a big relief to have Dio and Appice back in the lineup to breathe some pure air into the mix. There's a world where this is the last we heard from this lineup, but thankfully that's not the world we live in. For that, we'll have to jump ahead another several years. In 2006, about 25 years after his initial stint with the band, Ronnie James Dio rejoined Sabbath one final time. The label was set to release a compilation called The Dio Years, featuring the best tracks he'd recorded with the band, and so they decided to get back together with him and record a handful of new bonus tracks to tack on to the end. Happy with the results, Iommi decided it would be a good idea to bring that Iommi, Butler, Appice, and Dio lineup back for the new millennium. There was just one problem. Ozzy was already back in Sabbath. See, for a period of almost 20 years there, Black Sabbath was almost exclusively a touring name. Between 1995 and 2013, there were no albums to be found, and in that gap, that original lineup of Ozzy, Iommi, Butler, and Ward managed to find time to reconnect. First, it was for a few one-off shows, Ozfest headlining gigs and the like, but eventually things got so serious that in 2001, all four members were reportedly in the studio with Rick Rubin working on brand new material that Iommi alleges was really good. Unfortunately, life gets a lot more complicated when you get older, when you have your own music careers to tend to, and when one of you is about to start a hit reality TV show. Things fell through the cracks as Ozzy kept running off to finish his solo album, and aside from a handful of festival gigs, Sabbath was at a standstill. Enter Ronnie James Dio. Black Sabbath's original lineup might have been together in name, but that name wasn't doing much of anything, and Dio and Appice were right there ready to go, chomping at the bit to tour and get some new material written. As a compromise, the Dio lineup opted to go by the name Heaven and Hell to avoid confusion and any potential legal issues that might arise from two different entities named Black Sabbath existing simultaneously. Heaven and Hell toured for a couple of years, and in 2009, they released their only album under this moniker, The Devil You Know. I'll come out right off the bat and say that this is not just an excellent album, but that I could very easily entertain an argument for it being Dio's best album with the band. Now, I don't necessarily believe that wholeheartedly the way I'd like to. I still think it has a couple less exciting moments and has some pretty glaring production flaws, and it's generally too long. But when I said that Dehumanizer was good but didn't have any highs as high as their 80s material, this album has no such issues. In particular, The Devil You Know starts with an unbelievable 3-track run with Adam and Evil, an epic opener that exemplifies exactly what heavy metal in this era should have sounded like, Fear, which sometimes sounds like Dio is singing over Opeth riffs in the best way possible, and Bible Black. If you'll indulge me for a second, I like to be perhaps a bit hyperbolic but still heartfelt when I say Bible Black is the best Dio Sabbath song ever. Sure, it doesn't quite have the same iconic factor as Heaven and Hell, Neon Nights, Mob Rules, or Children of the Sea, but I think this track has all of those beat just in terms of sheer attitude. When Dio delivers the ending line of every chorus, you can feel it deep inside. He sells it with such an intensity and conviction. The riffs go stupid hard, the bass line is one of Geezer's best, and for a track in the 6 to 7 minute range, it's paced and structured immaculately. This would be a strong pick if I were to make a best Sabbath songs list. As for the rest of the album, it's just super solid modern heavy metal, not corny or uninspired like so many of its contemporaries. This is very clearly an album these guys have made together because they genuinely wanted to make something awesome and had over a decade worth of pent-up music ideas to unleash together. If there's one thing that this album is famous for, it's that it was the last project Dio was ever involved in before passing away from stomach cancer just 1 year later in 2010. It's incredible how, so close to the end, he was still pushing out some of his best ever performances, and if there's one thing I can hope for with this video, it's that this record won't go forgotten because it doesn't technically have the Black Sabbath name attached. If you heard this or any other Dio-era Sabbath album and enjoyed them at all, do yourself a favor and listen to some of his other projects as well, either his awesome solo career or his work with Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. He was a one-of-a-kind talent and one who doesn't deserve to live only in the shadow of the Prince of Darkness. Speaking of the Prince of Darkness, we finally move on to the last Black Sabbath album ever released, 13. After Dio's passing at the beginning of the 2010s, questions started popping up about whether there was a future for the band, and it wasn't looking great. Ozzy was still grinding through an endless churn of solo tours, and while in 2011 the original Sabbath lineup was confirmed to be together in the studio working on new material, Iommi's lymphoma diagnosis put a pretty immediate halt to that. Following this, Bill Ward came out to say that he would not be a part of the band going forward, at least until they'd offered him a signable contract, in his words. Things were pretty scattered for a while there, but at the start of 2013, things started to come together and we got confirmation that Black Sabbath were recording their 19th studio album, titled 13, to be released in June with a lineup of Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and drummer Brad Wilk of Rage Against the Machine and Audioslave fame. We got one single, God Is Dead, ? And then it was here, the very long-awaited Ozzy reunion, and unbeknownst to us, the final Black Sabbath album. So, is it good? Well, with an almost 35-year gap since the last time these guys wrote songs together, and even longer since they wrote anything that everyone agreed was great, there's a lot of different ways it could have gone, not all of them pretty. Luckily for us, I think we got a very solid, if a bit tired, send-off for the band. It's nowhere near as triumphant as Dio's Heaven and Hell farewell, but that was never really Ozzy's style in Sabbath back then, was it? What we have here instead is a moody, heavy, and doomy take on the band's classic sound. The production is modernized in all the ways you'd expect, for better and worst, but aesthetically this is undeniably Sabbath, and sees the band beginning to reclaim a bit of what made that original run so powerful. Iommi still had riffs, Butler's bass tone sounds great here, and while Ozzy's vocal performance is plagued with the dozens of overdubs that would haunt the tail end of his career, it hadn't yet reached a point of saturation where it was irritating, and in the context of this material, it does possess a certain charm that's pretty undeniable, that warbled effect evoking a sense of doom at least comparable to the one found on those early albums. I'll be completely honest here, I don't think 13 has a single song that you could consider a career highlight, but that's not to say it doesn't have highlights at all. The aforementioned God is Dead is a patient, heavy doom metal track that, at 9 minutes, very well could have dragged on, but miraculously manages to find just enough juice in the tank to keep it going, with a super heavy main riff, a simple but evocative clean guitar line for the verses, a vocal melody that fits snugly into Ozzy's range at the time, and a back half tempo change that would fit right in on albums like Volume 4 or Paranoid. Towards the middle of the track list, we also get Age of Reason, which starts out solid and ramps up in spectacular fashion, ending with multiple minutes of Iommi's most invigorated soloing of his late career. The album opens and closes pretty well too, but ultimately the album's biggest issue is that it moves so slow. I mentioned that God is Dead manages to keep itself engaging throughout its long runtime, but can the same really be said of tracks like Damaged Soul or Live Forever? Even tracks I love on here, like End of the Beginning and Dear Father, manage to find ways to lose my interest for a few moments in their runtimes. Combine with that the fact that this is one of Sabbath's longer albums at almost an hour long, and it's hard to want to come back to it in its entirety the way I do with pretty much everything else we've talked about so far. I hate to say it, but I do have to place some of this blame on Brad Wilk's drumming. Don't get me wrong, Brad is a fantastic drummer, one of my favorite rock drummers ever. His work on every Rage Against the Machine album was my initial inspiration to learn the instrument to begin with. But I honestly don't think he's a good fit for Black Sabbath at all. And not only that, but I think this slower material feels designed to make him struggle. Listening to 13, I can't remotely picture Brad Wilk being a part of the writing process for these songs. It feels like the three main members sketched these up and handed them over, and he just kind of had to hope for the best. For all these criticisms, though, I still think 13 is a solid album, and honestly, I think I wouldn't be so critical of it if they had followed it up with another album like was originally planned. Ozzy announced in 2014 that Sabbath would be releasing their 20th and final album in 2015 with production from Rick Rubin, and then do one final tour in 2016. The tour did happen, albeit still without Bill Ward, but the album never materialized. I would like to think that the band could have ironed out some of the kinks found on this album on another go-around, but realistically, I think they were all just tired, and that's where a lot of this album's issues lie. That's fine, I can live with that. I'm just glad that, of all the albums they could have ended on, it got to be one where Ozzy was able to say his farewells. 13 is still a really good album, and even if unintentionally, it acts as a respectable bookend to this long and revolutionary career. But not so fast. There's one more album I want to give some praise to before we move into the cursed zone. See, to a vast majority of people, real Black Sabbath only includes albums with Ozzy or Dio on vocals, if not just Ozzy. It's honestly kind of fair. Almost all the material that doesn't include their contributions kind of sucks, but not all of it does, and that's why I want to shout out 1989's Headless Cross, the second of 5 albums to feature Tony Martin on vocals. It's kind of incredible to think. Martin's vocal contribution to Black Sabbath vastly outweighs Dio's in terms of sheer amount of material, and yet he is infinitely more forgotten for it. We'll get to why that is in a bit, but first let's be kind. So, who is Tony Martin? Well, he might be the single most screwed over member of Black Sabbath's entire extensive lineup of members. He first started work with the band in 1987, landing the job through his manager Albert Chapman's connections as Black Sabbath's tour manager in the 70s, joining the band halfway through the production of an album we'll talk about later. He would be in the band for 3 albums, before being unceremoniously booted in favor of Dio, who had been invited back for Dehumanizer. Supposedly, Martin wasn't even officially informed that he'd been let go, he just stopped getting calls, and then Dio was announced as the band's vocalist again. After Dio left, and after a short-lived stint of Ozzy reunion shows, they came crawling back to Tony, who rejoined for 2 more albums, before once again getting the boot, this time in favor of an original lineup reunion. So, how does he fit into the band as the vocalist? Well, there's one thing we need to make abundantly clear here. Tony Martin is an excellent vocalist, and specifically, an excellent heavy metal vocalist. It might be hard to believe because most of the material he's on is pretty dire, but the man didn't get the job for no reason. He had chops, and over the right material, he really knew how to use them. Headless Cross is the right material. This album is first and foremost a badass display of what Tony Martin's version of Sabbath could have been if all the other factors had locked into place the way they did here. Iommi is the only original Sabbath member here, get used to that, but he's well accompanied by Cozy Powell, who had previously drummed for bands like Rainbow, Whitesnake, and Cinderella, and recording bassist Lawrence Cottle. They get the job done well, especially Powell, who brings a huge drum sound to the more epic moments here, extremely 80s sounding, but never veering too far off into cheesy territory, and certainly he's never lazy. What this album comes down to, ultimately, is the chemistry between the two Tonys, and here it's the best it ever was. Iommi's got riffs for days, and honest to God, some of his career best soloing, especially on the title track and Nightwing. Martin complements this perfectly with a soaring cry that has just the right amount of rasp to the shrieking high notes so as not to feel overly played up or showy. It's a wonderfully virtuosic performance that manages to avoid the generic feeling that some of his later performances would slip into. Headless Cross is an awesome record, one that is woefully overlooked even within Black Sabbath fandom spaces, and if there's one thing to take away from this back half of the video, it's that this is far from the inessential drivel it often gets made out to be by association. Give it a listen. And now we move forward into a section that I always knew I would have to implement into the Let's Get You Into series at some point, and that's Proceed with Caution. This is the place for albums that, for whatever reason, I simply can't recommend unless you're a real completionist or are curious what weirder kind of failed experiments a band might have attempted. Unfortunately for Black Sabbath, this section will contain nearly half of the band's entire discography, a whopping 8 out of 19 albums that are, in some way or another, poorly conceptualized or executed. I've pretty much never talked negatively about music on this channel because I like to think of this channel as a celebration of art rather than a place to pull engagement from negativity, but I also think it would be doing a disservice to my channel's integrity if I tried to soften my blows or couch my criticism with caveats and feigned enthusiasm. The writing in this segment will be a lot briefer than in previous ones. I don't see a point in extensively dogpiling these albums, most of which are already pretty universally reviled. But this is Let's Get You Into, so we've got to touch on everything, starting with the first Ozzy-era flop, Technical Ecstasy. Sabotage in 1975 was, as discussed earlier, an absolutely incredible album, and one that was well received by critics and fans alike, but relative to the albums before it, sales were kind of flagging. It was the first album by the band that didn't reach platinum status, and while quality on that album remained rock solid, it was clear that the Black Sabbath bubble was on the path to bursting. That burst came just 1 year later with Technical Ecstasy, the first true flop album, and one that would signal the turmoil that the band would spend the rest of their career trying to keep their heads above. This is an album with a fair number of defenders, and you know what? I kind of get it. Compared to their other bad albums, this one is at least trying to do some cool and interesting stuff, and it's experimenting, at least marginally, with what a Black Sabbath song can sound like. Unfortunately, I think the overall result of this experimentation is a dulling and dumbing down of their sound, rather than any exciting steps forward that I would want to hear them push further with. There are two great tracks, You Won't Change Me and Dirty Women, both of which are good largely based on the fact that they're standard heavy rock fare for Sabbath, but the rest is pretty much just miss after miss. It's Alright is handily the worst ballad the band had done to this point. All Moving Parts feels like it wants to be super proggy but ends up a sloppy mess, and no amount of remastering could save the nightmare that is Rock and Roll Doctor, which is basically a B-grade Ted Nugent song disguised as Sabbath. This album is not good, and while I still think it might be worth a shot if you're curious about where the train went off the rails, I can't recommend it in good conscience. A couple years later, in 1978, we got what could very easily have been Ozzy Osbourne's final album with the band, Never Say Die. This is another flop-era album for sure, but a part of me likes, or at least respects, it more than Technical Ecstasy. Don't get me wrong, this is still a tired, washed-up version of Sabbath that has no business coming out of the band that just released Symptom of the Universe 3 years prior. But compared to the weird quasi-experimentation of Technical Ecstasy, I find Never Say Die to be a much more honest album, one which doesn't posit itself as anything more than a fun little rock record with some heavy metal and blues influences thrown together in equal measure. Is it amazing? Absolutely not. Is it doing even one new or unique thing? No shot. But, you know what? If you're in the mood for some fun, generic rock with some tight riffs, big guitar solos, and the occasional sax solo for some reason, I do think there's a lot worse you could do than this album. I won't say this is a big step up from their previous record, or even that you should go out of your way to listen to it. It doesn't really have any big highlights or anything, but you know what? Everyone's allowed to have that kind of generic rock album that they dig, and I wouldn't begrudge anyone for saying this is theirs. Also, I think it's cool that Bill Ward got to sing a track, even if it's not amazing. Jumping ahead 5 years, we're now in 1983. Dio has done his first tenure as Sabbath frontman, proving you don't need to be named Ozzy Osbourne to make a great Black Sabbath album, and with him and Vinnie departing after Mob Rules, the band needed a new set of collaborators to try and keep afloat. Enter the lineup of then-former Deep Purple vocalist Ian Gillan, along with all the other original Black Sabbath members, including a returning Bill Ward for what would be his last recorded performance with the band. This album is called Born Again, and I'll let the words of Rate Your Music user Firefox1 in 2006 give you the rundown.
The heaviest and loudest album of all time. Nobody can scream like Ian Gillan. Probably one of the most underrated albums of all time. If you don't have this album in your heavy metal hard rock collection, you have to have rocks in your head. This is the heaviest and loudest album of all time, hands down. Must be played loud. Just download Disturbing the Priest and listen to the screaming and the heavy riffs, etc. Gotta be the loudest and heaviest song I've ever heard. If you're a fan of heavy metal hard rock and you don't like this album, you have some bad problems happening in your head. Download Digital Bitch right now and listen to that song a few times and you'll get an idea of how heavy this album is. Barry J. Gillis.
So, at risk of revealing the rock contents of my skull, I will say that this is not the loudest and certainly not the heaviest album of all time. There are, at bare minimum, 3 entire Sabbath albums that I think are heavier, not to mention the fact that some of those Deep Purple albums got impressively heavy as well. The loudness factor, though, Firefox might have been onto something, at least from a certain angle, because there's one thing he got right. Nobody can scream like Ian Gillan. There's a certain ferocity to his screech that works so differently to the belts and cries of Dio and Tony Martin. Ian Gillan is an incredible vocalist. I shouldn't need to tell you that, and his inclusion is not the factor that keeps me from enjoying Born Again. In fact, it's the saving grace of many of its worst moments. The problem with Born Again is a fundamental one that I have a hard time putting my finger on, but when I figured it out, it all felt so obvious. The mixing and production is bad, sure, it's stale and flat, but the real problem is a lot more fundamental than that. I don't think these guys wanted to be playing music together, or at the very least, I don't think they could really figure out how to do it. There's a lack of chemistry here that is almost baffling until you remember how many lineup and sound changes the band had gone through in such a short amount of time, how many members had been cycled through the Sabbath machine already, and how non-existent the idea of the Black Sabbath sound was at this point. The result is an album where I can honestly tell that everyone was trying their best, but none of the 4 pieces were fitting together, and the result is some of the most uninspired songs, unintuitive instrumental arrangements, and one fantastic singer who just can't seem to find his place in the band. There's a passion here that I can still feel, and it's why I think this album has so many defenders, but I just can't overcome the feeling that this is a whole lot of wasted potential with not much in the way of return on investment. Genuinely incredible album cover, though. So, Born Again with Ian Gillan didn't really work. Sales bombed, and reviews were overwhelmingly pretty negative. Having seen how the other side lives, I guess, Gillan decided to go back to what he was known for and rejoin Deep Purple, releasing Perfect Strangers in 1984 and effectively revitalizing that band's quickly stalling career. This left his replacement, Glenn Hughes, out of a job. Tony Iommi figured, hell, why not? I've already worked with one Deep Purple vocalist, why not scoop the other one for my new solo album I'm working on? So, the two got to work putting together a 9-track, 35-minute rock album before Warner Records intervened and said, "A solo album? We can't have that." And that's the story of how Black Sabbath's legacy was further tainted by this album, which is so clearly not Sabbath, but was still forced under the name and pushed as though it was the next big lineup change for the band. There's genuinely not a lot to say about this one because it's so clearly supposed to be a side project, and thus it's the kind of thing I would normally hand-wave in one of these videos as inessential. It's generic AOR slop, and that's a sound that already usually pushes me away, but this is particularly bad AOR slop that I don't think is worth your or anyone's time. If you want one track to take away, the opening cut In for the Kill is alright, but everything else is somewhere between bad and terrible, with No Stranger to Love being a significant low point on the album. No shade to Glenn Hughes, he's a solid vocalist in his own right, and he has one of Deep Purple's best albums to his name, but this just isn't it, and I kinda want to stop talking about it now. A year after that embarrassing but excusable outing, we got a proper Black Sabbath album in The Eternal Idol, the first one to feature Tony Martin on vocals. Unfortunately, I can't be nearly as positive with this one as Headless Cross because, aside from a couple decent tracks bookending the record, there's not a lot to like here, and for the most part, it just comes down to poor and derivative songwriting on all fronts. For the first time, we have a Black Sabbath album with almost zero memorable guitar riffs, and the songs they're tasked with upholding certainly doesn't do them any favors. As a first attempt at finding his voice within Sabbath, Martin does a relatively decent job, but it's nowhere near the quality he'd find 2 years later, and while most tracks, save for Born to Lose, manage to narrowly avoid being truly embarrassing, it's generally just a boring album with exceptionally few redeeming qualities. Utterly skippable. After the relative success that was Headless Cross, it seemed like the band might be on a path to finding their footing again in the new decade, but with Tear, those hopes were immediately squandered as we see the shambling corpse of Black Sabbath struggle to innovate and find a sound that suits them. By the time this album was being recorded, there were more Whitesnake members than Black Sabbath ones, and it really shows in how straightforward and generically cheesy it is. It's marginally less boring than The Eternal Idol, but I don't really see that as a positive when the alternative is a bunch of overplayed mythology cliches and underbaked instrumental performances from everyone involved. This is where the Tony Martin charm completely dissipated for good, and while it was a relief to hear Dio back in the saddle a couple years later, that glimmer of hope would be short-lived as well. Jumping into Cross Purposes, which is definitely the most quintessentially 90s album Black Sabbath ever put their name to, it's kind of hard to see why it's so reviled. Opening tracks, Eyewitness, Cross of Thorns, and Psychophobia are all fun rockers that continue the high-octane energy found all over Dehumanizer 2 years prior. Tony Martin is a notably weaker vocalist than Dio, made very obvious if you listen to these albums back-to-back like I did, and none of these tracks are going to be anyone's favorite Sabbath cut, but it's easy to be endeared by the way this album kicks off, and I went in with a ton of hope during my first listen. And then it happens. Track 4 begins, and immediately the band drives the train of goodwill they built off a cliff and never, ever manage to claw their way back up. Virtual Death is one of the most dire attempts at doom metal I've ever heard, and every song that follows it is some degree of boring or embarrassing. The band tripping over themselves to check off every single pitfall that plagued classic metal bands in the 90s. This album is perhaps the most disappointing one of them all for me because I genuinely thought I was going to end up being a contrarian and really enjoying it, but we simply cannot have that in late-era Black Sabbath. And of course, saving the worst for last, conveniently landing as their final album before the long hiatus, we have the truly incredible mess that is Forbidden. Hands down, the worst Black Sabbath album, and a strong contender for the worst album I've ever heard. This one's weaknesses are apparent from the very first minutes, and while the album is mercifully average in length at 43 minutes, every one of those minutes is spent displaying the absolute worst the genre has to offer, with some fucking hilarious creative decisions made throughout in such poor taste that you have to wonder whether this album had an editing process at all. Guest vocal features are a pretty uncommon thing in metal, even now, but when you do get one, it usually is to provide a different perspective lyrically, or to create an interesting contrast between two singers. On Forbidden's opening cut, The Illusion of Power, we get the only guest feature to ever grace a Black Sabbath album, and if you were to give me 100 tries, I don't think I could have ever guessed who they would pick. The opening statement that defines this album's identity and really sets the stage has a rapped feature from Ice-T. It lasts all of 15 seconds, right in the center of the track, making up a whole 0.5% of the album's runtime. And yet, this mess of a decision defines the entire project's identity, because while none of its other choices quite reach this level of derangement, they get pretty close. The transitions between verse and chorus on I Won't Cry For You are hilariously non-existent. Sick and Tired opens with a poor attempt to replicate the impact of Judas Priest's Painkiller drum intro before limping its way through one of the most chicken shit riffs Iommi's ever concocted, and the title track is one of the sloppiest, most grooveless tries at groove metal ever put to tape. Forbidden is a horrible mess of an album, just a true musical miscarriage that, even at their worst, most metal bands will never come close to replicating. And yet, I can't say the world would be a better place without it, because for as abysmal as all of this is, there is a sick satisfaction I get from hearing this band bomb in such spectacular fashion. Nobody should ever listen to this whole album front to back, but every once in a while, I think it's fun to skip around and gawk. And with that, we've reached the end of Black Sabbath's studio albums. We're almost done, but there is just a little more ground I'd like to cover before we close out, starting with live albums. There's only a handful of live albums Sabbath put out, and frankly, not all of them are worth hearing, but I'll point you in the direction of 3 that I think are essential if you still haven't had enough of the band, or you just want to know what it might have been like to see them in any of their eras. For classic era Sabbath, there's honestly not a lot to work with, but luckily in 2002, we got the archival release Past Lives, which contains both a recording of a show in 1973 and a bunch of very solid bootleg recordings from between 1970 and 1975, the prime era of the band. A crushingly heavy Sweet Leaf, a drawn-out Black Sabbath, and 19 minutes of Wicked World jamming are the highlights here, but really, it's all great. For Dio recordings, there's actually a good amount more out there to listen to, which is funny because he only did 3 albums, but that's just how it goes sometimes, I guess. Live Evil from 1982 is skippable because of poor sound quality and a relatively dispassionate performance all around, but if you listen to Live at Hammersmith Odeon, which came out in 2007 but was recorded around the same time as Live Evil, we get a much brighter picture of the band with an invigorated and high-energy show from start to finish. Dio even does a killer job singing Ozzy's songs here, even if he has to make some executive decisions on the fly to make them suit his voice better. If you want to hear a much older Dio do some of his stuff, Heaven and Hell also has 2 excellent live albums from the late 2000s which capture that excellent note Ronnie left us on. And of course, there's The End, recorded on February 4th, 2017, as Black Sabbath's supposed final show. This epic setlist, which extends out towards the 2-hour mark, acts as a nice bow on the Black Sabbath story, and while we know now that this wouldn't be the true ending, it's still a really impressive feat that they pulled off such a successful final tour and closed on a high note after such a turbulent run. It's bittersweet since Bill Ward was still absent for contract reasons, but that would be mended in due time. For this time, though, it was a really nice tribute to the band's legacy as the first and most important metal band in all of history. Are you still left wanting a bit more studio material, though? Do you want to hear the singers of the broader Black Sabbath collective singing in other bands? Well, boy are you in luck, because there's a frankly ludicrous amount of material out there from both Ozzy and Dio, not to mention the extensive Deep Purple catalog, which seems a little too tertiary to be worth going through. For Ozzy, his solo career is nearly as extensive as the whole band he came from's discography, And while I would love to dive deeper into that tangled mess, I had to stop myself because this video is already way too long. In brief, I would say that Ozzy has 5 albums worth giving an honest shot if you're looking for more. In order, they are Blizzard of Oz, which has mega hits Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley, Diary of a Madman with its fiery opener and closer, Bark at the Moon with an all-timer title track, The Ultimate Sin, which is perhaps his most underrated, and No More Tears, which sees him transitioning into the 90s a million times more gracefully than his former bandmates ever could have. On top of this, his live album Tribute, which is in memory of his original guitarist, is an absolute essential for fans of Ozzy's solo stuff, and has performances of a couple of Black Sabbath songs as a bonus. As for Dio, the 2 bands to look out for are Rainbow and the confusingly named Dio, which is not a solo project, even if I might have referred to it as such earlier, but happens to be named after him. With Rainbow, the albums he sang on are also the only great ones, those being the self-titled, Rising, and Long Live Rock and Roll. Rising especially is an all-time classic, with tracks like Stargazer and A Light in the Black really giving an early showing of why he was such a force to be reckoned with. As for Dio, the band, not the guy, there's another 3 albums to focus on. Holy Diver is the one you definitely already know if you're this far into a Black Sabbath video. The title track and Rainbow in the Dark are stone cold classics, but I think their follow-up, The Last in Line, is almost equally good, and Dream Evil, a few years later, doesn't fall much further behind. It's interesting to note the instrumental differences between Dio with Dio and Dio with Sabbath, because while he did make Sabbath work to his benefit musically, it's still very different from what he would do elsewhere across his career. And now we get to the part of the video that originally wasn't even going to be here. This video was supposed to end with an optimistic mention of the fact that, wow, Black Sabbath is going to get together for one final show in Birmingham, and they got Bill Ward back so they could end things the way they started. That's so cool. Isn't it going to be the perfect ending to this long history? And you know what? That's exactly what it was. The whole thing was live streamed on July 5th with a 2-hour delay to a peak of 5.8 million people worldwide and 45,000 people in attendance. And over the course of that 10-hour stream, we saw 19 different sets performed by a host of bands throughout metal's history. From Mastodon to Metallica, Gojira to GNR, Tom Morello to Tool. It may not have fully covered the bases of displaying the history of metal, but for an event this mainstream, they sure did pull out all the stops. Each band covered at least one Black Sabbath song, and there were 2 long supergroup sets with a rotating cast of tons of musicians cycling in and out for a huge swath of songs, adding up to a total of 23 Black Sabbath tracks performed throughout the day. A shocking number of which come from Never Say Die for some reason. In general, I think this event did its job perfectly well as an acting tribute to what the band had built over the past half-century. There were a few hang-ups for sure, sound quality on the live stream was spotty, and some bands certainly performed better than others. There were also some really questionable inclusions all throughout, especially living piece of human garbage David Draymond from Disturbed, and, albeit less egregiously, a full dedicated set performed by radio blues rock band Rival Sons, which feels just incredibly out of place. All in all, though, it was a rousing success, and as the night came to a close, the crowd and all of us watching from home were met first with an Ozzy Osbourne solo band performance, including all the big hits from his debut and the retroactively very apt Mama I'm Coming Home, and then Black Sabbath graced the stage one final time for a 4-song set of War Pigs, NIB, Iron Man, and Paranoid. I won't even comment on the quality of the performances because frankly, I don't care. The fact that this happened at all is nothing short of miraculous, a genuine stars-aligning moment that so easily could have been ripped away from us at any point over the past decade. This is the farewell that Black Sabbath deserved. And then, just like that, he was gone. Ozzy Osbourne passed away just 17 days later. In some cosmic sense, he had achieved his life's duty, and after a long battle with Parkinson's and a life lived dangerously behind him, he died at home, surrounded by family. This isn't the ending I or anyone wanted for this video. When I started work on this project almost a year ago, it was a nice video that both paid respects to and poked a bit of fun at a band I love very, very deeply. I wanted to honor the memory of Ronnie James Dio by giving his work with the band its proper due, and I wanted to give what respect I could to Tony Martin and anyone else who sang with the sinking ship that was late-era Black Sabbath. I wanted to wish the boys luck on their final performance, express my gratitude, and congratulate them all on a well-earned retirement. No one should die on stage. Nobody should work until the day they die. And I know people will say it's different with musicians, and especially with Ozzy because he was doing what he loved most. But I still feel a bit sick knowing that he didn't get to live the peaceful life he deserved and truly earned through a lifetime of touring and backbreaking. I don't know how to end this video anymore. I love this band so much. I love metal music so goddamn much, and I don't know that I'll ever really be done processing how much Black Sabbath means to me. The weight in my heart that this video was supposed to lift is still there because for me, this band is where music comes from, and music is my life. There is no way for me to truly be finished with this project because to ever find a satisfying conclusion, to break down or crack the code of Black Sabbath would be to find the answers to why I am the way that I am and live the way that I live. In a way, I feel like I understand Ozzy more now that he's passed because I too will be listening to and coming to terms with Black Sabbath until the day that I die. They're the blueprint for me. So, I hope you all enjoyed this video. I hope it was worth the year it took to make, and I hope that I can live in peace now that its shadow is done looming over my head. Rest in peace, Ozzy. Rest in peace, Dio. And to everyone else who has ever been a member of the band, thank you. And if you made it this far into the video, thank you too. Patreons are on the screen. I have links to that in the description. There's an Album of the Year video I've got coming out very soon, or maybe it's out by now, and more stuff is planned for the new year. For now, though, I can finally rest.